I'm Stephen Cass. I'm the chair of the New York City Bar Association Task Force on Climate Adaptation. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here to the association today for a program that we have developed and planned jointly with Pratt programs for sustainable planning and development, Better consulting firm, and a large number of wonderful community organizations, including the Center for Social Inclusion, Good Jobs New York, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, the Fiscal Policy Institute, Enterprise Community Partners, and Local Initiatives Support Corporation. As you all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has reported that the Earth's atmosphere now includes about 50% of the additional greenhouse gases that would push us as a planet over what is perceived to be the maximum temperature increase that the Earth's current ecosystems and civilizations can sustain, which is a 2 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. We're about halfway there. More recently, the United Nations Environmental Program reported that the nations of the world had made an aggregate number of pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions that, even if implemented, which they are not being done, would achieve only about 40 to 50% at most of the greenhouse gas emissions required to stay below that 2-degree increase. In all likelihood, as a practical matter, we are going to see global warming continue at the same or an accelerated rate for our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children, after which it may or may not taper off. The implications of this for the world's ecosystems and current patterns of human civilization are immense, as you all can see from the beginnings of the impacts that are likely to be expected. We saw it here in New York through Superstorm Sandy, which was itself a moderate storm, not yet a hurricane, which combined with sea level rise and a full moon had devastating impacts to large parts of our city. And you see it today in the Philippines, where likely tens of thousands of people have been killed and at least 1 million displaced and a whole city leveled. And you see it in the Midwest in today's papers with 500 homes obliterated in the town of Washington, Illinois. So adaptation is essential. And we have to start and have the opportunity to start here in New York and can perhaps learn some lessons, not only for ourselves, but for other cities around the world. And as you all know as well, a majority of human beings now live in cities, and in 20 years, 70% of human beings will live in cities. Many of those will be the most vulnerable to the impacts of flooding and a drought and other natural impacts that we are accelerating through our greenhouse gas emissions. Today's program intends to look at these issues, but adaptation, from our point of view, is not sufficient. It's important to look at not simply a resilient city, but an equitable city. And so rather than replicating physically the conditions that existed before, the ideal and important, essential adaptation program must include concepts of urban equity and addressing pre-existing inequities rather than replicating them. We also have to find a way to pay for this, and we need to have a process that involves people who are most directly affected by the impacts and by any adaptation programs. In short, we hope today, through the collaboration of those of you in the room and the many organizations you represent, to address three large questions. What are the essential components of a resilient adaptation program that includes physical resiliency and social resiliency and equity? Two, what is the process by which communities should identify those programs, review them, approve them, and implement them? Top-down planning, we've learned from Sandy, is not sufficient. Three, how do we pay for all this? We were fortunate to have a large appropriation from Congress to deal with the immediate effects of Sandy, that neither New York nor other cities can expect similar appropriations on a continuing basis. So what are the ways to begin to finance and equitably finance the adaptation and resiliency programs that we need to identify and put into a program? So we have three excellent panels. We have wonderful speakers who bring to you a wealth of knowledge and information. We hope that this will be an interactive program. You are all encouraged to ask questions and make brief comments at the end of each of the panel presentations. The panel programs have included time for that, but I do ask you to remember that there are others in the room, and please don't monopolize the time when you do so. We have coffee and various snacks over there, so you can help yourself as the program goes on, and we will have a short break at some point. There are restroom facilities outside, which you can use as you require, and we look forward to your active participation in this program. There is a microphone here in the center aisle, and if you have questions or comments, you can make them from there, or you can stand where you are if that's more convenient, in which event the moderator will repeat and paraphrase your question for posterity. So without further ado, let me introduce Ron Shiffman, who is the key partner in planning this entire event, whose idea this was, and who will moderate our initial panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's a bit early, and I want to thank all of you who've arrived on time so that we can begin on time. We have a very tight schedule today, and as a result, what I would like to make sure is that we don't have to go through long introductions of each and every one of our speakers. So you should all have a program, and in the program, in the order that the speakers will be coming up here in the various different panels, is a biography of the individuals. And I urge you to read that, and we will forego the introductions of the individuals. Just one housekeeping chore is that anybody who needs the restrooms, they're right out here to the right in the second hall down the way. There's food here for breakfast. Keep eating it so we don't waste it. I see many of you have come with your own coffee, but we really, there's plenty here, so please partake. I want to thank up front a number of people who have been really working very hard. Christopher Rice, who's outside, Kat, and a couple of other people, York, who've actually helped put this together over the last few days, and the organizations that have all joined in co-sponsoring this effort, and they're all in the program. What I'd like to do now is ask the panelists to come up. If Bettina can come up, if Maya can come up, and Duzan can come up, we can begin the program. The idea behind the opening panel is really to keynote and set the tone of what we want to achieve in terms of financing an equitable and resilient future. And there are a number of themes and guidelines that we want to underscore what we're going to be learning about both this morning and into the late morning. And part of that is not only how do we rebuild our cities and our communities from a physical perspective, it's easy for us to understand that in order to adapt to the challenges of climate change and issues like Sandy that have impacted and had a very devastating impact on our neighborhoods, we've learned that we have to raise buildings. But we think it's far more important to understand that resilience means far more than the physical environment. It means dealing with the social and economic issues that face communities. And so this morning's panel is an attempt to set the tone through which we look at financing the rebuilding of the city post-Sandy, but also how we adapt and mitigate against future events so that we're better prepared than we were a year ago. The other point, and this is one that I think has to be underlined, is that we're in a period of transition, and there's a challenge for our next mayor, an economic challenge, and we're going to have to find resources that we didn't think we had to be able to undertake the task of making this city a safer and more equitable city. So that's the reason for this panel, and without going into what they might be saying, let me introduce the first speaker, Bettina Damaiani, who is with Good Jobs New York. And Bettina has, as you'll read in her bio, has done quite a bit, but one of the best things in the city since Sandy has been a weekly digest of the activities around rebuilding efforts in New York. And I think I just want to point out that Good Jobs New York has been behind that, and Bettina is the brains behind that. So let me turn it over to Bettina, who'll give you a quick insight into some of the issue we.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out so early. So Ron wanted me to make the case for accountability and transparency as we move forward to rebuild. So I thought I'd do that by starting off with the bad news and hopefully ending with some of the more optimistic and good news. So I met Ron mostly and worked closely with him after 9/11, while there were many groups that tried to engage decision makers on how to spend literally billions of federal dollars coming into New York City after the attacks. And as we all know, the money went mostly into Lower Manhattan because that's what we saw in the attacks. And that's not to say that people and businesses in Lower Manhattan were not devastated by 9/11, but what happened was we didn't acknowledge that people all over the city were hurting because of 9/11. So one of the things we tried to do was engage people in the decision-making process. And you know that glass ceiling everybody talks about? It wasn't glass, it was like lead. There was just really no way to engage the decision makers. But we tried very hard, and we had some success in getting the conversation to change a little bit. And unfortunately, the bulk of the money went to very large corporate firms, and also a lot of luxury housing. We have a new Lower Manhattan, mostly because all of us invested our dollars in creating a luxury city. So that's where we're coming from. We also know what happened after Katrina, and there's an entire industry out there, disaster capital, that makes a lot of money on what happens after disasters, at the impact and at the expense of people that live in these neighborhoods that don't have the resources to fight back. So one of the bigger concerns that we have is that after 9/11, we had the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, which was not loved. I don't miss not having an LMDC by any sense. But right now we're a little lost about who really do we talk to? Who do we try and have an engagement process with in making sure that the funds are allocated equitably? The city has done an job on making sure that people are adequately engaged in how we spend the first round of community development block grants, which were about $1.7 billion. They held a 2-week writing comment period, which was 7 days longer than what they were supposed to. I guess we should be grateful. But they've amended that plan 4 times. And I'm not sure, those of us in the room, I'm assuming, are following this more closely than the average person, and I'm not sure we all knew that they were going to change this plan, which is fine. We want them to be able to be flexible and address the needs of our communities. But we also want them to talk to us. We want them to engage us and let us know how this process works. And the city actually, this is sort of a step back. The city's done a very good job over the past few years of opening up their doors, telling us how they spend economic development resources. They have the best local subsidy disclosure in the entire country. They've actually taken money back from companies that didn't create the jobs they said they would. So my concern is that we're kind of going backwards a step or two when the city really has set a new standard on transparency issues. So if you want to learn more about how some of the 9/11 money was spent, you should go to our website, goodjobsny.org. We have a database where we've incorporated a lot of the 9/11 resources and obviously the day-to-day economic development resources in New York City. So some of the good news is, first of all, you all are here. We have lots of people that are engaged. We have many different eyes that are engaged in this process. We have organizations that are working to empower people on the ground that have been suffering long before Sandy and highlighting the inequities of that process and making sure that any funds that are coming in will help address those concerns. That sounds a little more easy than it's actually being done, but there's more happening now than there ever was after 9/11, I guarantee it. We all should be recognizing that this is an optimistic point. And also, on sort of the larger environmental resiliency issues, the mayor actually has spoken very eloquently about how we need to be better prepared. We also have to make sure that, as he's talking about making South Street Seaport and maybe the Hudson River a very fancy place to be, we also need to make sure that other parts of the city that often are not part of the fancy press releases are engaged in that process and making sure that we're not harming people on the ground. One of the programs that have been proposed by the administration is called the Neighborhood Game Changer Program. I can tell you my hair goes up on the back of my neck every time I hear that. And it's true, we need to change the dynamics that are happening in our low-income neighborhoods, but we don't need to do it by displacing them and bringing in companies that know how to take advantage of these systems so well. Another bit of good news, which just came out yesterday, is the next round, or more money that's coming in from the federal government on the Community Development Block Grant Fund, will have an expanded opportunity for public engagement. There'll be public hearings now, so you can, if you sign up for that weekly email that Ron told you about, we'll be sure to tell you all about it. We have a section of our website that also will list all of this, so you should check out our website for that. And then, as also Ron mentioned, we have a new administration who came in on a platform of acknowledging the inequities that are in our communities and our society, and actually talked about corporate subsidies a whole lot. So we think that's an optimistic point. Does that make it easy for us? No, it actually makes us have to work harder, right? We're gonna have to hold the new administration to a new standard. And using Sandy resources is really gonna be a unique opportunity to do that. So I think that hopefully it'll end up on a more positive note. There's still lots of work to do. We have bad examples in the past, so we know that we can build from them and hopefully not relive all the bad examples of what happened after we used disaster resources. So thank you.
Basically, I think just to underline what Bettina said is that transparency and accountability is a critical issue that we need to look at and build into every aspect of the rebuilding effort, and how we go even beyond rebuilding to adapt our environment to the challenges of the future. Our next speaker is someone that I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years. I have the honor of actually sitting on her board at the Center for Social Inclusion, and in the immediate aftermath of Sandy, spoke to Maya, and together we decided that we would try to partner in looking at how we engage communities, and particularly communities of color, in the process of rebuilding. And as a result, we now have this program called RAMP. I always get it wrong, but it's somehow Recovery, Adaptation, Mitigation, and Planning, and partnering with the Center for Social Inclusion on that, and a series of MARFA dialogues around the city of New York to really engage communities in the rebuilding process. But I don't want to infringe on Maya's comments. I think she knows how to speak for herself. So let me turn it over to Maya.
Thanks, Ron. And Ron can infringe upon my speaking anytime. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was just thinking transparency. I apologize in advance because I'm going to run out right after this panel because I have to have some transparency and accountability with my child's 8th grade teachers today for parent-teacher conference. But this is a really important conversation. I'm going to lift up, I completely agree with all the things that Bettina shared and the great work that New York Jobs with Justice has been doing. I want to lift up the issue of race. Because when we talk about equity, we're talking about many things. We tend to be more comfortable talking about economic inequities, of which we have many. And the part that we tend to get confused more about is how race factors into inequity, particularly when you have such a vast wealth divide in this country, despite race. So I want to share a very specific story to kind of highlight why I think innovative finance is so critical to racial equity and why racial equity is so critical to climate change and to becoming more resilient in the face of it. So in Boston, you know, Massachusetts is one of the states that did something really important. It said, we are going to commit to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 25% in a decade, and by 80% by the year 2050. That's a really aggressive, impressive goal. So how does a state get to an 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction if every single citizen of the state cannot participate in that? I would argue that it's impossible. Now take the Roxbury community in Boston. By the way, this case study is a case study I'm sharing that's up on our website at the Center for Social Inclusion, and we have 2 more, and we will continue to be adding to these case studies in addition to a scan that we're just producing on renewable energy projects happening in communities across the country. But in this case in Roxbury, which is largely a community of color, historically black, it's 80% of the community gets low-income heating and air conditioning assistance, right? Meaning they're low income enough that they actually have to get government funds just to pay their utility bills. Most communities of color in this country are actually paying 30% more for their utility bills and utilizing less utility, right? Which means wealthy people actually pay less and use more. So when you saw that New York Times article after the horrible typhoon in the Philippines where developing countries got together yelling and screaming at the first world, we have some of that dynamic actually happening right here in the United States. So what happened in Boston is a group of 3 community-based organizations, black and Asian, multiracial, got together and said, okay, we're going to try to meet this state challenge and make sure Roxbury can participate. And for Roxbury to participate, we see a triple bottom line, right? What's a triple bottom line? We see how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through home weatherization, right? Something we even encouraged through federal policy and stimulus. Part of what was enabling Massachusetts to do this. Really important policies. And if we can do home weatherization that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, we can also help low-income people reduce their cost of living and take what generally is true for many communities of color, old housing stock, right? So one of the reasons people's utility bills are so high is their housing stock is very old and therefore inefficient, right? And they can't afford the updated utilities, refrigerators and washing machines that save on energy. So they said, and at the same time, we can actually solve one of our big significant problems, which is unemployment. So what we'll do is we will create a home, and here's the other thing about race. There are home weatherization companies all over Massachusetts. They just weren't in Roxbury, okay? So not only do you don't even have the private companies necessarily servicing you when you're low-income communities of color. So then they came up with this really innovative idea, right? They said, we're going to create a worker-owned cooperative that is going to do home weatherization, and we will be able to contribute to the state goal, to national goals, to global goals, and we will lower people's cost of living who are low income. We will alleviate some of the need for monies to go to programs like these, and we will create jobs in a community that's desperately in need of jobs. Well, guess how much it costs to set that up? $300,000 in startup capital. Guess how much they got? 30. So that's a problem, right? And that's a problem we see playing out all over the country, which is community-based efforts in communities of color to solve multiple problems that contribute to their inability to both bring down greenhouse gases, but do it in a way that's fair, right? That do it in a way that recognizes that right now we have to share in the benefits and burdens of public policy, and we're not. The poor pay more, people of color disproportionately poor, paying more, generally utilizing less, and frankly having to pay more for it. So then if you turn to New York post-Hurricane Sandy, and I want to invite everyone, we're having our last Marfa dialogue on resiliency in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy at the Queens Museum this Thursday. Right, that's the 20th, right? Jared's going to. Thursday, the 20th, beginning at 6 p.m. Jared Green is on my staff, and he'll answer all your questions. Wednesday, thank you. See, they just tell me where to be, and I just show up. And Ron Shiffman is also going to be participating. But part of what we're seeing is, if you look at resiliency, particularly, or if you at least look at vulnerability, right? Vulnerability in New York City, what you see is 66% of the vulnerable population lives within a half mile of a flood zone. These are communities that are deeply invested, and we see from poll after poll after poll, the communities of color are just as, if not more, interested in climate change and in stopping greenhouse gases as any community. And one of the reasons is because those communities are often ground zero for the impact and less able to actually participate in rebuilding, not because they don't have assets, not because they don't have ideas, not because they don't have energy, but because they get bypassed by policy and investment that would actually enable the innovation we need them to have if we are actually going to make the impacts that we want to make on climate change. There are many different ways to do this. We need policies that change how we own, that actually support more complex forms of ownership, that's locally scaled. We need energy. We literally need energy efficiency and energy generation strategies that recognize we need local scale ideas. We need more investment in high-speed internet access, because none of this is driven without the 21st century technology that makes it possible. Communities of color are also more likely to be bypassed by high-speed internet access for a lot of the same reasons. So there are fixes. I think we're going to have a lot more discussion about some of the innovative financing models, but if we don't include financing in the equation, if we don't actually think about the ways to create financing models for community scale efforts, we actually will change the equation on our ability to bring down those greenhouse gases, because remember that by 2042, there will no longer be one racial majority in this country. And if 50% of this country is unable to participate in solving the problems of this nation, all we will have is a broken nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Maya's comments remind me of the fact that in the 60s, when we first passed, actually the 70s, when we first passed the Housing and Community Development Block Grant money, a number of groups around the country organized and really pressured that the monies being used be targeted to benefit low and moderate income communities. And part of that was the adoption eventually of Section 3, which exists in every contract that the city and the New York City Housing Authority enter into. And Section 3 requires local hiring and local procurement. Cities certify that they do it. It links back to what Bettina says. They certify it, but they don't do it. And if we began looking at financing mechanisms that required targeting, that targeted to community-based groups, to communities of color, and environmental justice communities, then we would be doing a big service to using the resources that we have available to accomplish more than one goal. And I think that's partly why we've asked our next speaker to come here and to present. And before I introduce Duzan Doepel, I really want to acknowledge the fact that the Consulate of the Netherlands has played a key role in introducing us to some of the innovations that have been going on in the Netherlands. And Duzan is one of the people that we've met through that effort, and later in the day we'll be hearing from Marcel Ham and others about innovative finance mechanisms abroad and how they may play a role in at least helping us adapt some of those to our own local needs. I first met Duzan on, I believe it was on Independence Day, July 4th this summer. And I visited him and his colleagues in Rotterdam, where they were undertaking a very innovative, both educational and business development incubator. And he'll touch a bit upon that. But I saw in the work that he does a multi-layered approach to rebuilding our cities, to rebuilding our neighborhoods, and to making sure that people who really needed the resources were beneficiaries of that. But that also generated a need for a multi-leveled approach to finance. So we've asked Duzan to come here and to share with you some of the things they're doing and some of the ways they're being able to implement it. So Duzan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ron. Well, thank you for having me. Whenever I speak internationally, I get introduced as a Dutch architect. I'm an architect, I'm not an economist, but that's not actually true. I'm South African. I grew up in South Africa in Johannesburg, and I studied in South Africa. And why I say that is that in South Africa, or in any developing country, there are two issues which are crucial when you're dealing with urban renewal. And that's the issue of scarcity and the issue of exclusion. But one of the main assets we have in those countries is human capital. And I've entitled my talk for today Towards a Circular and Inclusive Economy, because I really believe that as architects and planners, we need to start developing models which strive for a circular and inclusive economy. And it's not only in developing countries. Since the effects of climate change have become more and more evident, since resource depletion has become a much more relevant topic, since peak oil and since the economic crisis in the Netherlands, we've really started rethinking the way in which we make cities. And one of the biggest challenges we have in Rotterdam particularly is that we have a huge mismatch between supply and demand on the labor market. We have 60,000 young, able people willing to work at this moment in time. We have jobs in the technical and the healthcare sectors, and there's a mismatch that the jobs and the people are not finding each other. So I really think it's crucial to start coming up with new models which not only address the physical and spatial aspects of adaptation and mitigation, but also address the models for inclusion. One of the key concepts that we are working on, and yeah, excuse me, I'm an architect, so I can't speak without images, and too many images, is the idea of closing city cycles, closing loops. And what we're doing is looking at ways in which we can close energy, water, material, and waste and food production loops in cities. And at the same time, looking at ways in which we can include talent development in training programs to actually link mitigation and adaptation to talent development and job creation. One of the strategies we've developed focusing more on energy is REAP, the Rotterdam Energy Approach and Planning. And it's a 3-step strategy for reducing the CO2 footprint of the city. The first step is reducing demand of energy. The second step is reusing waste streams. And the third step, once you've done the first 2 steps properly, is producing sustainable energy locally. And what we see happening, especially at the second step of reducing demand, is that it's very difficult to do that on a building of exchanging, excuse me. It's very difficult to do that only on a building scale. You need to start looking at the district and the city scales. I'd like to quickly talk about 2 projects that we're doing in Rotterdam, one which is practical, one which has really been implemented, and one which is much more theoretical, to demonstrate a little bit the way in which we're looking at this notion of closing city cycles in relation to job creation. What you see is an image of Rotterdam Delta. The Maasvlakte on the left is a land reclamation. The Dutch are famous for their engineering feats, as you know. And what's happening is a lot of the inner city harbor developments on that grey area of the map are moving out to this new development in the port, which means that we have a lot of inner city harbor land which is becoming available for redevelopment. I'd like to focus on the top left-hand part, which is called the Merwe and the Vierhavens, on 2 projects, the Haka project and a more abstract project that we developed for the Ministry of Housing called Resiliency. Very abstract, but there may be some lessons that we can share based on that project. The first is the Haka project, which is a building in the old industrial harbor. It's been vacant for 20 years, and we were asked to come up with a concept for rejuvenating this building based on the notion of closing material cycles. So what we did was we looked at material loops in the region and try to identify which waste streams we could actually use for rejuvenating the interior of this building. And that led to an interior which is primarily built by waste materials from demolition sites. The design is not so interesting, but the process is really interesting, because what we did was we built this whole interior using ex-detainees. I believe you call them returning citizens. I had a really interesting discussion with the bishop from Washington, and he said they're not ex-detainees, they're returning citizens. So since then I call ex-detainees returning citizens. But what we did was we implemented this project using ex-detainees in a reintegration program. And what we did was we monitored also what the effect of this approach meant on the building scale. And this is a bit of an abstract diagram, but to give you an idea what it meant in terms of CO2 reduction, in terms of labor cost reduction, and in terms of material cost reductions, was a reduction of 70%. What you see on the diagram as well, that it took 3.5 times as long to realize. So this is kind of an interesting analysis of a project, because it teaches us how can we actually achieve our mitigation goals and some of our social inclusion goals, and how can we optimize that. So the optimization is in speeding up the process. So what we're doing now is talking with the RDM, how can we connect this concept to the concept of Skill City, so that we can actually prefabricate these elements for future projects whereby we will be able to reduce the production time. The second project that I'd like to touch on is a project called Resiliency. It was projected into the future in 2040, and the question was, in an inner city harbor location, how could we come up with an urban morphology and transition process that would lead to a circular economy and also to more inclusion. And the traditional model for development in the Netherlands is not working at the moment. Land has no value. So how can you develop an area if you have no land value? So the idea in this project was to look at the notion of connecting flows, service flows, energy, water, material waste, data, mobility, food production, in long-term exploitation models to the development of the area. So it's much more exploitation orientated and service with service level agreements than a district development based on pure land values. And we also asked the question, instead of projecting a program on the area, can we come up with a sustainable, resilient urban morphology and model which is context specific for that location, which will sustain a vital and resilient waterfront community. The area as it is now is very monofunctional industrial area, not unlike many inner city harbor areas around the world. But what's interesting is, as I said, a lot of these activities are moving out to the ports. So it's one of the unique locations in the inner city where we can actually build afresh. Another challenge is that it's an area which is in an unembanked area. So what we had to do was come up with a concept for an urban plan which is also climate proof. So we looked at the idea of extending the dike over the site, creating a climate proof park which connects the surrounding neighborhoods to the waterfront. Step one of the strategy is to reduce demand, and this we did on two ways. Firstly, looking at optimizing the public transport and network and introducing electric mobility, and the second was to look at a low energy urban morphology. Optimizing the public transport, the most obvious way to do it in this location was to use the water as an access, and actually by strategically placing water taxis we could create a condition where from any point in the location you could be in the inner city of Rotterdam within 10 minutes. This was combined with a very intricate bicycle network and pedestrian network path, and also localized electric mobility and parking for electric mobility. So we actually generated a car-free zone. What we also did was, using bioclimatic design principles, come up with a low energy urban morphology. It's a high density, low rise morphology based on the specific microclimatic conditions of Rotterdam, of this location. And in so doing, coming up with the right morphology in the right location, you can lower your energy demands dramatically. There are a diversity of typologies and a diversity of densities also relating to the location on the site and the access to public transport. The second step was to exchange flows. So the first thing that we do is look at how can we optimize waste streams in the area. We have a lot of industrial waste heat in our inner city, and what happens now is we use the waste heat at a very high temperature. And what we proposed here was to create a heat cascade. So instead of using waste heat at 90 degrees for all of our functions, we only use the high temperature heat for the functions that it needs. So we start to cascade heat from industrial use to greenhouse use to low temperature heating for housing and building to fish farming, thereby optimizing the energy that we have. Excuse me. I think it's the air conditioning. The second strategy is obviously the idea of optimizing waste flows from production. So the idea of ecological, industrial ecology, thank you. Looking at which functions do we have in the area and which new functions can we add, which close those loops. I have this every time I speak in an air-conditioned space. The third aspect was looking at material flows. So when we consider the city as a material bank, which demolition flows can we use to actually build our new housing stock? So we produce a concept for using demolition flows from the demolition of the site to produce our new housing stock. And the third step is the smart production of water, energy, food, and materials. And based on the idea of closing water cycles, producing our own water in greenhouses, producing energy by multifunctional use of surfaces, an idea to use a football field of a day for energy production at night as a football field, smart facades on buildings for energy production during the day, and at evening they open up to let out, to let in light. And food production on an industrial scale, and fish farming within this inner city industrial harbor, led to a new kind of business model. But the last step, which I also want to touch on, is quickly the idea of using saved environmental and social costs for realizing some of our social housing ambitions. What we did in this project was looked at the idea of swell remediation through industrial hennep. By using industrial hennep for swell remediation, we could lower our swell remediation costs, produce bio-based materials for the retrofitting of the existing social housing stock. So trying to link business cases and use saved costs, social and ecological, for the new business cases. Last slide. Take another sip of water. So actually what this theoretical model tries to demonstrate is through a multi-layered approach where energy, water, material, food production, diet, and mobility start to interact over long-term, with long-term exploitation as a model. In this theoretical case, it was actually possible to come up with an urban design and a neighborhood which would be energy plus, water plus, and food plus. And the interesting question is, what does that mean for the way in which we participate in our neighborhoods, in our districts? What does it mean for the way in which citizens become active shareholders in neighborhoods and actually part owners of these different systems? And in what way could these new models result in a more equitable future? Thank you. It's really terrible.
Thank you, Duzan. Duzan flew in just the other day, and I guess that plus the air conditioning affected your voice today. But and we also had him busy yesterday meeting a number of times with some community leaders in the city of New York to see whether or not we couldn't begin to adapt some of the models that that he discussed today. There's one direct application that grew out of my visit to the Netherlands this summer that really is sort of links together the issue of accountability and the issue of targeting and race consciousness. And that is that when we saw some of the examples of interventions in the Netherlands, particularly the use of some of the public spaces for multi-purpose functions, such as the retention of water as well as the creation of new plazas and things of that sort. We were also confronted in New York City with the New York City Public Housing Authority threatening to sell part of the green space that surrounds public housing for luxury development. And in order to offset some of the costs that Public Housing Authority needs to renovate their own buildings and to maintain and operate them. But when you look at some of the approaches that are coming from the Netherlands, one of the things you realize is that in a city where you are threatened by floods and surges, that perhaps managing water and using that land to better manage water is a better appropriate use for it. And so working with the Coalition of Public Housing Residents, groups from the Lower East Side, a group of attorneys, a lawsuit was filed requiring that the Public Housing Authority go through an environmental analysis before even offering the land for other uses. And this comes particularly in the light of the fact that we will see additional floods in areas that are quite vulnerable. Public housing occupies a good portion of public housing, sits on those lands. Those lands also not only are needed to manage water, but also to reduce the heat island effect. And so that we don't, because we expect the numbers of days of over 90 degrees to triple by 2050. So when you begin to look at all of that, all of a sudden, if we began using other resources to retrofit those buildings, perhaps we can both retrofit the buildings, pay for that retrofit, and at the same time create areas that create safety not only for the public housing residents, but for the adjoining communities. And so you begin to look at what Maya was saying. How do you layer all of these things, and how did they do it in the Netherlands, and how do we apply it? And later we'll be hearing from Marcelham and a few others who really could talk a little bit about the mechanisms of financing some of this. All of what you see here, these slides, and the presentation will be on the website. We will send out the information to you how you can access it, both the videotaping of the presentations here for sharing with others, as well as the slide presentation that Duzan just made. We've got a few minutes. I don't know how many at the moment. I think it's about 7 minutes. Why don't we open it for questions from the audience, or any
Steve
questions
said
that the...
we had 15. I'm going with Steve's number because it was bigger.
It was bigger?
He said 15.
15? Well, we'll see. Let me first ask the panelists if you have any comments or anything you want to say before we open it up to the audience.
You know, I want to thank Duzan for his presentation and just say, you know, there are communities. Jackson, Mississippi, there's a black developer who's actually lives here in Brooklyn, who's trying to do a very similar project in Jackson, Mississippi, and even had the idea of how you try to create green manufacturing jobs in the Mississippi Delta. And once again, a lot of the problem comes down to not having the ideas, but in building the political will to support the ideas and therefore bring the capital to those kinds of innovators rather than taking the capital to the big traditional corporate folks who actually aren't creating any triple bottom line equation. So it's not because we don't want those corporate actors, but there's even a way to be in partnership differently. But if you don't build the political will, if you don't have the community planning, if you don't have the actual political, small p political capacity to make these projects happen, and that the folks impacted are able to push for them, a lot of them fail.
Any questions? Steve? Use the mic, please, since you insisted that we put it there. I'd like to ask the people in the back to sort of come over here and fill in the front. It makes it a lot more comfortable to see your faces.
And this is where you're supposed to ask questions from, right here, right? I wanted to follow up on Maya's last comment and Duzan's last comment, his last gasp there. Duzan was describing a program which is exciting, and but it sounds as if it were developed essentially top-down by a series of professionals. And Maya is emphasizing the importance of community buy-in, community training, community participation, and the triple bottom line, addressing both race and economics. And I was going to ask you, Duzan, what process did you follow or did you fail to follow that we ought to be thinking about here to accomplish what Maya wants?
It's a good question. What's unique about the location that I was discussing is there are actually no people living there. So there is no community. We did sessions with stakeholders. I worked together with Jan Rotmans, who's an expert on transition management from the Erasmus University. And what we did was basically work in arena sessions with stakeholders. And the stakeholders in that area are the utility companies, the landowners, the parties who actually want to develop from this multi-layered concept. And together with them, we developed a long-term vision and strategy, which we translated into a stepping stones, into a framework for change, for transition. So no blueprint, no plan, but a collective vision of where we want to go to, and a framework for development. And that's the framework that's being used now by the municipality of Rotterdam to open the discussions to potential market parties, private parties who are interested in developing in that area.
Why don't you tell us who you are and ask the question?
Thanks. My name is Tony Daniels. I'm an architect and urbanist practicing here in New York. My question is, or maybe it's a comment. We'll see how it comes out. Supposing that we assign land value on the basis of our capacity to exploit it in a system of closed loops, energy, waste, and so on, how can people avail themselves of the benefit of a land valuation scheme that's like that? And what honestly would be the prospect of our adopting something like that? For instance, what if we in a simple way attached building and development rights to production capacity or energy efficiency? How could we make an equitable scheme on that basis, and who could reap the benefits?
Who's the question addressed to?
Well, I guess that it would be either to Maya or Bettina, I think.
I think that's something we really have to ponder, unless anybody wants to answer from the panel.
Well, I think you're raising a really important question. One thing, and I think the question is, can it work equitably? And I think that probably part of the answer is maybe. And the maybe is one of the reasons why so many of our energy efficiency policies are inequitable is because they assume ownership. The vast majority of particularly blacks and Latinos are renters in this country, and most of the tax credit programs that we have, tax credits that we have, federal and state, usually go to homeowners, which means particularly after this financial crisis, we have many fewer homeowners even in communities of color than we did when so the disparities have grown. So it does, as part of my point about it, actually requires us to think differently about what kinds of legal structures we have for how we consider ownership and how we create policies that create the opportunity for this. So I would not say that they can't be inequitable. That they can't be equitable. I think the question is, how do you take into account the ways in which all of us are positioned differently to ensure that we're all able to participate and benefit?
Yeah. Thank you. Let's also have some of the next panel think about that issue as well. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Bessie Bazil, and my question is also connected somewhat to what the previous speaker, but more directly to Maya. You mentioned that bypassing the people in the community of color. And you also mentioned that there was a program in which you were trying to reach $300,000 and you only raised $30,000. I'm asking, what I would like to know, do you look for, especially in it's not only in community of colors, poor people in general, they don't have a voice. So they're going to continuously be bypassed if there's not a system or programs where these people can have a voice. And what would you propose, or what other avenues, how would you give them a voice? Because I know you're going to say the elected officials, but the elected officials barely speak to only people who vote for them. And a lot of people in New York City, they don't really, I don't know what the percentage of people who vote.
So I agree with what you're saying. First of all, it wasn't our project. We've been documenting innovation in communities of color and what's getting in their way. This was 3 community-based groups in the Roxbury community in the greater Boston area, but so I don't want to take credit for their good work. And they were all organizing groups, so they were all working on voice and power and recognizing that as environmental justice and worker rights groups, that they actually had to think about how they participated in the economy. I think, so this actually was an example of policies that we don't have in place that we have to create, because the policies were good and just didn't go far enough to figuring out how communities of color and low-income communities of all races could participate. So I think it's that our policies don't go far enough. And in order to get them there, if you go on our website, there's a new case study we've just put up from California of community groups in Oakland actually that created a really effective local ordinance that I think we should look at for New York City that required a certain level of local planning, community-based planning, and actually created standards that required, essentially required the process to enable communities to have this kind of innovation and created some investment. They actually now have a state-level strategy where if they can get the state-level policy passed, that will funnel more funds down to enable the community-based projects and the community-based voice. So I don't want to, I think you're absolutely right, and California is a place in which some of this is happening in some exciting ways. They didn't get the state policy passed. They did get the local ordinance. It's a good model to look at.
And I just want to jump in. I think one of the issues we have to address is obviously the political capital and will of people on the ground, but recognizing that much of this money, particularly after Sandy, is coming from the federal level, where they really can set a standard and force these funds to leverage the kind of changes that we're talking about today. And also including in New York, we have the 197A plans, where it's sort of exactly what Maya is talking about. The problem is, it's like much of our community boards, it's sort of this pie in the sky, oh, that's very nice, you all talk to the community about what you want, but we're bankers and politicians and we know what's best. So really, I think the challenge is recognizing that local officials may not be able to do this, but we have to really push our federal officials to put some type of leverage and provisions on the federal money that comes down, whether it's Sandy related or not.
Yeah. One of the panelists who isn't here today because he had to be in Washington that we had invited is Eddie Batista from the New York Environmental Justice Alliance. Eddie is a community organizer, and Eddie, I think, would argue that one really has to go out into many of the neighborhoods and begin to develop an organizational base. We know from research studies done particularly in Chicago, but in elsewhere, that a community that is well organized, that has a social and community infrastructure in place, tends to survive better under stress than communities that don't have it. And this whole idea of community organizing, which has lost a lot of favor and a lot of support over the recent decades, really has to be re-engaged, because there are areas, my colleague Stu Perch is in the audience, we're working in one community presently with a group of students that is really needs a level of organization, really needs some people out there that can knock on the people to bring them together to create the kind of civil infrastructure. And we have to look at building that civil infrastructure as much as we have to look at how we rebuild some of the physical infrastructure. There are 3 people there. Let's keep the questions short and the answers short, and just introduce yourself and go ahead.
Hi, my name is Gregory Carr. I'm a recent law school graduate, and I'm working with a Philippines-based road-sharing organization, Share the Roads, partnered with the Sea and Earth
Use the mic.
and also partnered with the Sea and Earth Advocate School, another Philippines-based organization, and trying to raise money with the Center for International Environmental Law. But my question is, how do we urge policymakers, officials in government, to act and inform them of the urgency of the climate crisis? And are there specific examples of where you felt you've had the most success? Because this is something I'm struggling with, especially since so much work has been done since the 70s, and we had actionable intelligence since then and haven't really moved forward.
Okay, let's go to the 3 questions, and I'll ask the panelists to respond since time is limited. Thanks.
This is more a comment. Eric Kaufman, I'm the CFO of the New York Wheel, the big wheel that's being built in Staten Island. Through those efforts, I've gotten very interested in climate resilience, and I've come up with a not-for-profit platform that I call the Natural Resilience Fund. I'm trying to get enacted a climate resilience investment tax credit. It's along the lines of what you're talking about, not necessarily home ownership, but a funding gap for the mayor's plan, because that resiliency plan has
Can
a
I
$5
ask you to
billion.
hold that for the next panel, because I
Sure.
think we'll have people who could really address it then, including the former housing commissioner who I saw in the room. Is Richard still around? Okay. There he is. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Ressler, and I'm an organizer with the Responsible Endowments Coalition. And we're trying to connect student organizing at universities, moving endowment funds out of big, fossil fuel companies, the private prison industry, and into community solutions. And so I was wondering if any of you have examples of alternative finance mechanisms that are like community loan funds that have been successful in partnering pension funds or endowments with community resiliency projects.
That's a great point. Again, make sure you raise that with the next panel as well. If that's all the questions, let's close. Is there one more? I'm sorry.
So my name is Irene Chang Samino. I'm with FEMA and HUD. I just started a position earlier this month to ensure the protection of the federal investment in the Sandy recovery. I won't share my title, but what I wanted to encourage the group to understand is that the federal government has taken resiliency at all levels very seriously. HUD, as you mentioned, the CDBG-DR funds are intended to largely benefit low and moderate income communities, and we understand that those are the most vulnerable populations in this situation. So I want to encourage folks to really look at the federal body of knowledge on this. There's a Hurricane Sandy rebuilding strategy that embodies a lot of the things that you've been talking about today. The Dutch government actually lent us a very senior cabinet level person in the form of Henk Ovink, who has been working on something called Rebuild by Design, which is a regional design and planning competition that's sort of entering stage 2, and specifically encourages the participation of the local governments and a regional effort in thinking about how the larger impacts are not limited to individual communities and cities, but as a whole. So there's a really holistic approach that we are trying to accomplish. One final thing that I really want to encourage folks is that I think people have been listening. Eddie was very involved in the rebuilding strategy, as was the Ford Foundation, in bringing the folks who advocate for individual communities to the discussion. And HUD has heard, and so in the second tranche of funds, which will focus more on infrastructure and large-scale projects, there is a 30-day comment period for amendments to the action plan, and that is something that I think everyone should be looking for. And just to note that the amendment process is intended to allow everyone to go to one place to look for how the money is being spent by each grantee, instead of sort of talking about individual programs. And so I want to encourage you to go to the city and the state websites that are also mandatory to allow you to get the information that you and your constituencies are looking for.
Thank you very much. Let's go very quickly with the lightning round and ask each of our panelists to conclude your final statement. Why don't we start with you, Duzan? You've traveled.
Well, I'm not really qualified to answer any of those questions. I think they're much more local questions. But I think it's essential that we start, well, this kind of conference is essential for sharing knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge. We know that there are a lot of technical solutions. The Netherlands, we have a lot of technologically based solutions for climate adaptation and mitigation. In the US, you're also leading, but the real issue is indeed sharing the new financing models, finding the new financing models and the new organizational models. And that's where the exchange is really, really necessary. So I'm really pleased this kind of dialogue is started, and I hope it will continue in the years to come, because we can really learn from each other.
So I want to address a couple of the questions that were raised. The first, and I think Irene's comments speak to this. We have a broken Congress. So, if you want to talk about the problem of, our government addressing global climate change when we have folks that say it's not real, that's a broken Congress. So one of the things that we've seen, though, is we have 3 more years of administration that will do anything it can within its administrative capacity. And what we need to do, and I think Eddie Bautista, who's not here because he's down in D.C., would say that those conversations with the federal government, particularly HUD, have been extremely productive at moving some of the agenda that the environmental justice communities around the city have been trying to move and have gotten some really important measures in. So I think what we're looking at is 3 years of trying to do as much as we can, at least at federal level, administratively, to get more innovation happening in communities. One of the things I think we have to do better for those of us who want this kind of transformation, particularly social equity, racial equity, is we have to recognize that we don't get more foot soldiers in a war unless the foot soldiers are able to produce something locally. So this is actually one of our opportunities to building much more ability for people to leverage at a higher national level by supporting local innovation. Secondly, I would say that yes, we do need many more innovative ways. Tax credits can be useful if they're done differently. So I would be very interested in hearing more about that idea. One that we've been proposing and playing with is energy investment districts, so that we're actually creating a way to leverage public and private dollars, because one of the big challenges with endowments is that they actually have to have much larger projects and much larger ability for projects to say that they can produce a return on the investment. What happens in these community innovations is they tend to be too small, and the returns, therefore, a little too risky for endowments that need a guaranteed or need to feel like that they have a guaranteed return. So one of the things I think we have to look at is ways for, but I think the endowment strategy is important. How can we find ways to pool investments so that we're coupling them with startup investments, both from foundations. That $30,000 the community got was actually very important in Boston because it enabled them to do a business plan. They just couldn't get then the startup capital that enabled them to act on the business plan. So anyway, I just want to say that it's not because there aren't opportunities for this. I think these are the kinds of questions that we need to work more collectively to answer. And I'm hoping also for the lawyers in the room, because I also think we need more legal mechanisms and more legal innovation that enables some of them to happen.
So 2 very quick points. One is to acknowledge, yes, the federal government has actually been a little bit better on Sandy issues than it was after 9/11 and Katrina. The Sandy Task Force put out a report in August that really did address a variety of issues and engaging people on the ground. The one fault we have with it is it doesn't require these things to happen, so that's obviously the next step. And also, New York City communities have really been beaten down by this administration. Their voice have not been heard. We've invested billions of dollars in economic development resources in communities that really did not benefit them at all. So we have, in a way, a little more work to get to before we can feel that people are engaged in the process. And then the other is the community development block grant funds. Yes, they're there to help low-income communities, but we have decades of development that has to happen in this city. We can't put it on the back of the CDBG funds. We need to be more innovative about how we use resources. There's talk about broken down Congress. There's a bill in Congress for tax-exempt private activity bonds, which we called them Liberty bonds after 9/11. In Katrina, we called them GO bonds. I don't care what we call them, but we need something like that, but not exactly like that, because that would take all day to talk about how poorly utilized those resources were. But we need something along those lines to recognize that that's what these communities need, because these cash grants are not, first of all, going to be around for very long. If we're supposed to follow by Congress, they have to be allocated the next 2.5, 3 years. So we need to recognize that the federal government and tax-exempt financing bonds are going to be necessary, and we need them quickly.
Okay. I think we do have a dysfunctional Congress. We have a incoming progressive administration with a great deal of expectation but very few resources, which means that the next panel, which will be chaired by Jesse Keenan, and what they have to say becomes really the centerpiece of what we need to do here. This is the beginning of a conversation, and we hope each and every one of you who have ideas will send them to us. We need to compact them so that we can feed the transition teams, but it is going to be a long-term effort and not just a one-month effort. We really have to hold the incoming administration and hopefully the new Congress in 2014 accountable to the needs of the city and communities, not only in the city but elsewhere. Jesse, you want to come on up? And I want to thank the panelists for a good discussion, and thank you all for being here on time.